Hi everyone, I'm Natasha, the CEO of Cable, and today I'm speaking to Chris Zehner, Cable's very own CTO. Chris joined us recently from Mercury and previously Commure, Atrium, and Meta. But it wasn't just his phenomenal background that excited us so much, it was his passion and excitement for compliance. We're going to talk today about his background and career, his role at Cable, and even the relationships between banks and fintechs. So let's get stuck in. Hey, Chris, thank you for joining me.
Hey, my pleasure. Glad to be here.
So let's start off with the elephant in the room, compliance being exciting. It seems like no one ever sets out to have a career in compliance. So I want to start off by hearing how you got into this space. What was your path into compliance?
Yeah, so I'd say I got into compliance because I really enjoyed working in fraud early in my career. So before I was a software engineer, I was really excited about statistical forecasting. And the first job out of university I found letting me do that was fraud fighting at Meta. So I was working on their games product, looking at um, s- stolen credit cards, fraudulent transactions, that sort of thing. And I moved from there into data engineering and then software engineering. Worked in trust and safety for a while. I had a really exciting job at a law firm, and my wife is a Finnish attorney, so I got to go home and ask a lot of questions about how does this work, and got it was really great. I felt like I really enjoyed working in like a regulated space. Um, Ended up in healthcare during the early stage of COVID. And then I had the opportunity to go to Mercury to work on their risk engineering and product team. And when I joined, I thought, oh, what fun. I get to work on fraud problems again. But Mercury, while they're not a bank, they are a fintech that offers like bank deposit services. And I thought, knowing about fraud, I'd be 80% ready to tackle it. And it turned out that that 80% knowledge of fraud I had was only 20% of the knowledge I needed to do the job. So I was really fortunate when I got there that I got to work closely with our compliance team and help build a lot of the tools that help Mercury transition off a banking as a service platform and build direct relationships with their banking partners. Um, so that's really how I got into compliance. It was just part of my job for a long time. And I had great mentors and people inside the company that I could ask questions of. And we had plenty of things where there was a lot of urgency to get it done because it was blocking the business, or our banking partners really wanted to see this change happen on a deadline. And so those were really important to us to get right. And learning compliance just became part of the job.
It sounds like you really fell in love with, I guess, two of the three parts of compliance that I always describe I fell into fortuitously. So I have a law degree, I became a chartered accountant, and then I learned to code. And it seemed to me when I started working in the financial crime space that financial crime is basically accounting, it's all the money movements, following the money, plus law, the regulation, plus coding. How can we use the analytics to understand what's going on? How can we put these building blocks together, and so on? And it sounds like you think maybe in a similar way the coding aspect and the legal aspect, and it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say what I always told people on my engineering team when I was at Mercury is it's great to have a balance of fraud fighting and compliance work, because compliance is pretty clear. They tell you when they're writing the regulations what you should be doing. And obviously, there's a lot of nuance to doing that correctly. Uh, but you can sort of read and figure out what's the right thing, what's the wrong thing if you have enough context. Fraud fighting is the opposite. Like, you're never going to get it right, no matter how hard you try, because in my experience, even having the sort of like insider advantage of seeing the code base, knowing how the systems work, being able to change and tweak things, the people who are committing the fraud, they're very smart actors. They're not doing great things, but um, it's a struggle to just stay two steps ahead of them. And so having that balance of like, hey, here's a really high adrenaline activity that's fun and constantly changing, with like, hey, here's something that's very stable and very clear, and building towards that. I think it's like a really nice balance in the risk space. And obviously, I'm all in on the compliance side these days, being at Cable. But it's definitely like two two very different activities, and like both are really fun.
Yeah. You touched there on super smart fraudsters doing interesting stuff. And maybe it's not great stuff, but it's certainly very smart and interesting. Can you talk us through one of the most exciting things that you've either, discovered or found when doing your fraud fighting or in your financial crime work? What was the most exciting thing that you've worked on in this space?
Hmm. I think there were a lot of things that were personally exciting. I think probably the most adrenaline exciting was sort of being at Mercury the weekend that Silicon Valley Bank um, was having difficulties. There was just a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of our internal conversations were focused on understanding what's happening, what it means for the ecosystem, and how to enable the customers of Mercury's who were affected or people who were looking for another banking solution while also managing our own internal risks. And so we were just working around the clock trying to balance all of those things and make the right decisions. And um, we had a really small team at the time. So it was a lot of, we've never done this kind of thing for a customer before. Is this the right time to sort of like make that change and try something new, knowing that it could really make a difference for somebody's business? Uh, I am a little bit of an adrenaline junkie, although not so much that I would do something like skydiving or swim to Alcatraz or back from Alcatraz. But I definitely really enjoy that sort of like sense of urgency of like, hey, we really have to figure this out. It's very focusing, and I think like that focus is fun to have occasionally, and that's where fraud fighting becomes really exciting.
Yeah.
Um,
What's the most adrenaline-filled thing that you've ever done?
oh,
If you've not done skydiving, what have you done?
I haven't done. I would go back to Silicon Valley Bank weekend and say that was it.
That's a
Or
little
defer the
sad.
question. Yeah, it's a little bit of a weak answer here, but
So, of course, as I mentioned right at the top, you've recently joined Cable as our
yeah,
CTO. What made you join us?
a couple of different things. So I got to work with the Cable product when I was at Mercury. Mercury was one of the early customers of Cable, and while I wasn't a direct user of Cable, I was managing the risk engineering team that was receiving a lot of the feedback that were coming from Cable's testing systems. And so one of the things I really saw value in was how much Cable was able to do for um, the compliance team at Mercury, people who didn't necessarily have a lot of support from my engineering team when we were focused on the urgent things that were like directly in the path of working with our partner banks and our partner banks compliance needs. Um, so we got a lot of feedback from Cable about areas where our systems could be improved, areas where especially we didn't have the data to show to auditors or partners um, that things were working as expected. And sometimes one of the things I learned is that sometimes having those data gaps is almost the same as having gaps in our actual controls, because if you can't show that something's happened, it's very difficult to defend that your controls are happening and working as you expect and as you're telling people. And
Mhm.
having the view from Cable of here's what's happening with 100% of our um, customer accounts, and here's where the data is missing to defend those things, helped get those things prioritized and moved up to the top of my list while I was at Mercury. And
Mhm.
so I saw a lot of value, even as like an engineering stakeholder. And then I also really believe in what Cable's doing. I think it makes a lot of sense to say, you know, we're going to replace this manual process that takes armies of people at especially the largest banks with something that takes less of your internal resources and provides you 100% coverage of the regulations. Like it's such a big difference to go from manual sampling where you're pulling 50 accounts and reviewing them in depth to saying, hey, every time this happens, we're actually checking and verifying these other things. And so I think that's a really compelling piece of it. And I was also very impressed with the people I met. I think everybody really has a passion for compliance. And in my experience working at Mercury on the engineering side, it's hard to bring that passion for compliance and that ability to talk to compliance people um, to every part of your organization. And so I really see like how much value we can add for compliance teams who are trying to really build a world-class compliance system and help their businesses understand the importance of meeting these regulations and what the regulatory requirements are. So yeah, I was really excited for a lot of reasons. I also really liked one of the engineers I talked to. He was great. We had a really good chat. So that didn't hurt either.
Yeah, I'll let PT know. Um,
Yeah.
what is the so now you've joined us. It's your first CTO role. It's actually our first CTO that we've ever had here at Cable. What is the hardest part of your job as an early stage CTO?
It's probably wrangling how many things we could be doing and trying to get those clearly laid out and worked on sequentially. Like we can't do everything at once, but we have a ton of opportunity ahead of us. And so figuring out what are the opportunities that matter the most and how do we carve out space for those and keep that focus going without neglecting everything else that we've already done, that we've already committed to our customers, so that we're making strategic progress as well as like solving our customers' day-to-day requests. That's definitely the biggest challenge. And there's a lot of other things that go into learn a new code base, building a new team. But I think like at this stage of company, it's really just like how much potential there is, and turning some of that potential into reality requires a lot of focused execution more than anything else.
Absolutely. It's the ongoing challenge at this stage of business, just prioritization. There is
Yeah,
so much that we could do. How do we break that down? And we
yeah,
have an exciting product roadmap for Q1, which I can't wait to get in our customers' hands. And that's what you've been working on a lot over the last couple of weeks.
yeah. And
Um,
I'm really excited that I'm fortunate that I joined at a time when like the value of the business is so apparent because of how we're working with our existing customers and what they're getting out of it. So we're not really in that stage of trying to figure out whether or not we've made a good decision to build this business. It's really about like taking this business that is a good business and seeing how fast can we build it forward and how can we make it great.
yeah, absolutely. Um, how do you envisage cables technology sort of advancing and changing in the next few years? What are the biggest areas that you're going to be focused on?
It's a great question. I think it's an interesting one because there's some things that cable does that I think you would think are a little bit anachronistic if you look at sort of where technology is trending. People are really starting to focus on LLMs and AI and what's coming there and how fast the pace of advancement is moving and trying to apply that to every area. But I think like one of the discussions that we've had internally quite a bit is how much what cable's doing is grounded in regulatory truth, and there isn't room for sort of statistical inference in that. And so I think one thing that we believe pretty strongly is we can continue to provide ground truth for compliance teams at banks and fintechs that gives them confidence in their data and their systems. Sometimes that confidence is going to be confidence that there is a problem, but hopefully in most cases it's confidence that there isn't a problem because we're testing 100% of what they are concerned about. And so I think that's one area where we're actually going to be contra the trend for quite a while as we continue to lean into sort of establishing a ground truth that's grounded in the data that we work with, that our customers provide, that we work with, rather than trying to apply techniques of statistical inference, which is essentially like, the trend from logistic regression to ML to AI is really all about like better and better uses of statistics. And so there's always that room for statistical error. And this is,
Mhm.
I think, one of the big differences between risk and compliance is how in risk, you're really saying what's the probability that something bad is happening here. And when you have a high enough confidence, the right thing to do is to prevent that. But in compliance, you really have to know, it's something is compliant or it isn't. And in both cases, you have to know the ground truth. And so that's an area where I think like we're going to make big advances and we're going to take advantage of those AI technologies, but we're going to use them in service of building that ground truth. So I could see a world where we do a lot to work with our customers to simplify their understandings of what we're doing and provide them with, you know, more insights into how are their systems working. And that's something that we probably could power with LLMs. But at the stage when we're testing customers' data, it doesn't make as much sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think another big thing that we've talked about is to what degree is Cable's focus going to be on case management versus testing capabilities? And I think the answer in the long run is we probably want to give customers both, because there's a lot of value for our customers in having a single solution or a single place to go that provides a jumping off point for their compliance systems. But as we look at the months ahead, you know, a lot of our focus is going to continue to be on testing, because right now we have a really strong foundation in money laundering regulations like BSA, AML, or MLRO, depending on the geography you're in. But when we think about how many regulations banks and fintechs partnering with banks are concerned about, you know, we maybe have like one of the biggest areas under control, but there's a lot of mountain left to climb there. And so that's an area where I think like we need to figure out what it's going to take to move as quickly as possible there. And how do we do that as simply as possible? And I'd say like the last big area of technology that we're thinking about is one thing we've seen again and again when we work with fintechs and we work with banks is often we're not working with teams that are compliance experts. So we work with their compliance teams, and then we also work with their engineering teams, their data teams, their IT teams, people who really intimately understand their systems and can work closely with us on like technical priorities, but maybe aren't bringing the same understanding or care for the compliance domain because they have other responsibilities in addition to compliance. And so we find ourselves in a position where often our engineers know more about compliance than the engineers, even at these banks and fintechs we're working at, because this is what we do day in, day out, all day, every day. Whereas these other engineering and IT teams have other responsibilities. And so something that I think we are thinking about is how can we double down on that sort of like focus on compliance within our engineering and technology team? How do we make that one of our key things that we're hiring for, key things that we build internally, so that our engineers are as capable of talking to the compliance folks as other compliance people are. And I think that really becomes a differentiator in the care we can bring to the product and our ability to bridge that gap that sometimes exists even internally in organizations.
Yeah. Fantastic. And you just gave everyone listening a bit of a taster of what's to come in 2025 from Cable. First and foremost, lots of different regulatory frameworks. So automated testing of areas beyond the BSA as we have live today. Absolutely. So now you are here as CTO, and you have a team that you are managing and that you'll be building out. Tell us a little bit about your approach to building a high-performing engineering team, especially in a space that many people would consider to be fairly unsexy, compliance. How do you get engineers excited? How do you build that high-performance team?
Yeah, I think my experience has been, and I think Cable bears this out, that even spaces that don't seem sexy from the outside, there's a lot of interesting engineering problems and a lot of what I think gets people excited and motivated is building something great. And so part of that is giving people the understanding, like I was saying before, to understand what great means within our space. Like, how do we help the engineers who are building systems know whether they've built a great compliance API or whether they've built a system that like encapsulates what a chief compliance officer might need when filling out a risk assessment? How do we let people understand what the users who are using Cable really want and value? And I think a lot of that right now is giving people context. And a lot of that context is coming from you, from other people who've been at Cable for longer, who speak to our customers every day. And I think it's starting to come from me as well when I talk to the engineers. Um, but I think everywhere I've worked where we have great engineering teams, it's always about giving the engineers enough context and enough autonomy and enough breathing room to really like focus on building something great, and then also constraining the problem enough that the things that we're building that are great from an engineering perspective are also valuable and great from a business perspective. And so I think like that constraint and aligning the engineering problems and the business problems is a big part of what makes a great engineering team. Because you can have a team of amazing programmers who don't deliver much business value, and you can have a team of people who deliver a ton of business value, but the way they do it um, makes it harder and harder the longer you work in the code base. And so keeping those two things sort of aligned and in sync is all about giving people accountability and clear expectations, trust, autonomy, and then like the context to align all those things with what the business needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going to pause because my dog is
Yeah,
whining. We'll edit this
take your
out.
time. Yeah,
Get in
I
here,
figure a lot
doggy.
of this will end up getting edited out. So
She's
yeah,
whining at me. All right, and we're back.
feel free to let me know if my answers are too anodyne as well. So they're
No,
not
it's good.
spicy
It's
enough
good.
for LinkedIn.
um, Wait a minute. Let me just think about.
Yeah,
I'm going to go next. Maybe. So that makes a lot of sense, trying to give engineers enough context and then space to really run at the right goals. We've got a lot of change going on right now at Cable, and we're bringing our engineering team to be pretty much full time in person in San Francisco. Um, what are your views on remote teams? That you worked remotely for Mercury for a very long time, and Mercury is predominantly a remote only company. How are you thinking about, this small engineering team at Cable and the value that we would get from being in person?
yeah. I I'm actually a big fan of remote work. I think it can do a lot to enable people to have the time to focus. I worked the majority of my career I worked in an office, but the last almost 5 years I've been predominantly remote. And I think that there are different. Hmm, let me try this again, and we can edit. But I think there are different struggles that you face with an in-person engineering team versus a remote engineering team. Um, I think we have a good cadence with the engineers we have in the Bay Area now, where people are in the office 2 to 3 days a week. It's not mandatory, but we find that time in person to be really helpful and valuable for like catching up, getting context, and then also the days that people aren't in the office tend to be quite focused days where there's a lot of heads down work happening. And that balance of, in-person context sharing, discussion, communication, I think really helps us resync and stay on the same page, both around, the big picture of like, what are we doing? How are we building this team? What projects are we working on? But also the small things of how do we think about evolving the code base? What are the key parts of our engineering culture that we like, that we want to change? You know, do we like this pattern of handling errors this way, or is there something else that we could be doing that's better? And I think that one of the real values we get as a company at our stage from being in person is the amount of that shared culture building that's going to happen over the next 2 years as we get most of our engineering team here. And we go through the sort of process of really trying to go from we've proven out this business, we have a working technology to like, hey, we want to push hard on this and scale and execute quickly in service of that. I think the missteps we avoid by having those high communication channels are really going to come from being in person and having that shared context. I think the flip side of that is we have to make sure that we have enough time for engineers, whether it's in the office or people working from home a couple days a week, to really like go heads down and focus and find that time for deep work. I think my experience being remote as an engineer was always that it was great with very few downsides. And as a manager, I've always found it much harder to manage remotely than manage in person. But I think the burden of managers to sort of like take on that extra work and figure out in service of like really making the lives and professional performance of the people under them great.
Hmm. Yeah. It's it's definitely going to be a change for us to have so many people in the office 2 to 3 days a week, and bringing over some of the people who've been with us longest, our English engineers, is going to be fun for the folks here, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to get to spend more time with them in person.
Yeah. So compliance officers, compliance is such a hot topic right now. Compliance officers seeing a lot of new technology all the time, um, having a lot of pressure from the regulators, more consent orders this year, the embedded banking structure, the banking as a service structure, having a lot of scrutiny. How do you think the role of technology leaders within compliance specifically has changed over the last few years?
I think that there's a lot more of an expectation that people are close to the cutting edge of where things are going. Even if you think back a couple of years to when crypto was a really nascent industry and was growing quickly, there were a lot of questions about how to manage that, what tools are working, what tools aren't working. And I think that that cycle is just repeating itself as like finance enters new areas. There's a great newsletter that I really like called Money Stuff. And I think one of the jokes that they make frequently is um, every area of finance is just rediscovering all the rules that standard finance discovered over the last couple hundred years. And it just happens faster and faster. So I think a big part of where what we're seeing is just like the pace of innovation is continuing to speed up and pick up as new technologies enable finance to move into new areas. And it's forcing, I think, compliance professionals to keep up, it's forcing technology people in compliance areas to keep up as well. And I think one of the things that we're really starting to see is there's more need to be a specialist in more areas. And that's creating both like a need for breadth that I think sometimes hasn't existed in the past when there's been more time to learn on the job and go deep in a specific area for a long period of time in your career. And I think it's also creating what for us, and many other sort of like compliance technology companies is an opportunity to like really understand a specific area of compliance and provide supplemental breadth to some of those areas. Like before I joined Mercury, I I wasn't at all familiar with the three lines of defense model. And joining Cable, where we're primarily focused on sort of second line of defense activities, there's a lot going on there already, and each of those areas has sort of like a corresponding depth. Um, but it's a really interesting space, and I think knowing who we're trying to serve can give us a lot of focus. But I think if I were doing second line of defense activities at a fintech or a bank right now, um, I'd just be feeling like I'm in a whirlwind as the pace of innovation just keeps expanding.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I guess apart from cable, which would no doubt be your answer, what is the piece of technology that you're most excited about in the compliance space that you think some of these compliance officers and technology leaders should be looking at?
I think LLMs are the answer to that, but I think you have to be careful, especially as a compliance professional, in how you utilize them. I think one of the things that we're seeing in sort of like the product space and the engineering space right now is there's a lot of powerful sort of feedback loops that you can create between a person using an LLM to move faster. I think it's easier to build a startup today with a smaller team and move at a higher velocity than it would have been 10 or especially 20 years ago. And I think we're seeing that bear out in a lot of ways. But I think it's also true in the compliance space that like, you know, these are just another tool, just like, Excel helps you do calculations faster. LLMs can help you do specific tasks faster as long as you're aware of the downsides and you avoid using them as the basis for your judgments. I think, especially in compliance, human judgment is a really crucial um, piece of understanding regulations and deciding how to interpret and handle things that may fall on one side or the other of the regulation, but for human judgment. And so finding the ways where you can use these new technologies effectively in the compliance space, I think is probably a really hard problem in the space right now, but also one that's going to unlock tremendous value for the people who are working in it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, definitely. I just, as you were talking and thinking about the pitfalls there, I had an idea that somebody will probably build an AI startup that, automatically generates risk appetites for banks without understanding that that's absolutely not how you can generate a risk appetite for banks. So
yeah,
yeah. Um,
exactly. I expect to see that in the next YC batch for sure.
yeah. Um, so having worked at a fintech that worked with sponsor banks, how do you see those relationships changing over the coming years, given all of the scrutiny in this space and all the change in technologies?
I would say the biggest change I see coming there is more of a focus from sponsor banks on understanding deeply where fintech's risks are, what their customer profiles are. I think there's just going to be more active involvement on managing the risk and compliance program across or between sponsor banks and fintechs. I think what we've seen previously is there's a huge variety of risk appetite and understanding of this fintech space across the sponsor banks. And I think with the renewed regulatory scrutiny and some of the things that we've seen in the ecosystem over the past couple of years, there's just a lot more understanding and focus of like where those risks could be. And I think that's getting increased scrutiny um, and renewed attention. And so I expect to see a lot more of a collaborative relationship for the sponsor banks that are continuing to work with fintechs. I think it's very possible that some banks will say, hey, this isn't within our risk appetite, or we have a very limited risk appetite for this kind of behavior. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for banks and fintechs who can closely collaborate and maintain a good compliance relationship.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, Aside from banking as a service or embedded banking, the community banks are definitely needing to find new ways to innovate and increase their margins and deposits and so on. Aside from that embedded banking route, what are some of the ways that you think community banks could be innovating as they move into 2025?
Yeah, I think a big part of community banking innovation can come from looking at what is working well in other spaces of embedded finance and thinking about how can community banks offer that directly to their customers. For instance, one of the credit unions I was part of when I lived in Austin, Texas, they have sort of a roundup program where on your payments they can take, they round up the payment to the nearest dollar amount, and then they put it automatically into your savings account for you on all of your debit card payments. And so I know people who bank there and they have that turned on for their kids, and that's one of the ways that they're helping their teenagers save money. And I think a lot of where community banks play a vital role is actually within that community, like helping people learn the basics of managing their finances. And I think when you look around at like where innovation is happening, there's a lot of small things like that community banks can pull in that will have a big effect on the people that they're serving in their sort of like local geographic area or the people who sort of like matter most to them.
Yeah. So taking the innovations that the fintechs in the banking as a service space might be using themselves or even building themselves and using those at the banks internally to benefit their direct customers, really.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who are drawn to those kinds of features and it causes them to sort of go through the I'm going to switch what fintech or bank I'm using. But a lot
Mm,
of those things that are adding value, they're too marginal to cause somebody to switch or become a customer of a fintech. But especially when you take them as a whole, I think there's a lot of innovation that regular banking customers who maybe aren't paying attention to the fintech space could benefit from. And that's something that community banks can really bring back.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, all right, so we're going to wrap up today with a couple of more personal insights into who Chris Zehner is. So
Let's do it.
tell me, Chris, what do you read to keep up to date with compliance?
So before joining cable, I was reading money stuff, which I really enjoy as sort of a lighthearted uh, look at sort of the financial industry. A lot of where I was keeping up with compliance when I was at Mercury was driven by Mercury's business needs and sort of our internal compliance folks. So they'd be sharing changes to regulations along with their opinions internally, thoughts on where things might be headed in the industry, lots of discussion about obviously the things that affect us specifically. And, I was always just running, trying to keep up with learning about the latest area of compliance that we needed to make changes to internally. So one area that's near and dear to my heart is currency transaction monitoring or currency transaction reporting, CTR requirements, because I ended up very early on in my time at Mercury, spending a lot of time working on that system there. And that was really fun and got me deep into the weeds on that specifically. But I've heard really good things about the Dark Money Files, which is a podcast that is in my queue to listen to. But I'm always looking for more good compliance resources. So if you have any to recommend, Tash, please throw it my way.
Yeah, I saw that Claros, the consulting group, are starting to do a newsletter, so I think that's going to end up being a must read. I'm
Oh,
on that, signed up for that.
yeah, I
Um,
signed up for Paper Trails, but
of
you said
course,
you sort of uh,
don't talk about cable. Paper Trails is our monthly newsletter here at Cable. Um,
yeah.
what do you do when you're not fighting crime?
So I have two young kids. They're almost two. My son's turning two next month, and then I have a 3.5-year-old daughter, and that really keeps me busy. I'm really happy to be living here in San Francisco, where I can walk around with my kids, take them to a park. We rarely use a car, uh, but when you have kids, you're not allowed to have hobbies for about 10 years, is what I've been told a couple of times. So I like doing construction. My wife and I did a lot of work along that vein in Austin. I don't think we're planning to do anything like that in San Francisco, though. So right now, my hobbies are pretty exclusively limited to doing stuff with my kids, and then maybe the odd book or two. I like sci-fi and history as like my primary reading interest. So almost always something to turn off my brain.
Yeah, as long as it's not the Gruffalo or something else. Those are most of the books I read right now are children's books.
Oh
I
yeah,
think you're right that when you have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, it's pretty much that is your life. Um,
yeah.
well, awesome. Thank you so much, Chris, for chatting with me today. And now get back to work. um, thank you, everyone, for listening, and I will see you all soon.